edition of Midweek Moment. As I mentioned last week, June is our education month, and every June we approach topics that are critical to both spiritual and natural education and elevation. In the past year, we have covered financial foundations, and now this year in June, we will be tackling our wealth building series. Particularly, we will be focusing on all things real estate. Real estate is a hot topic in the market right now. As we are in the thick of the pandemic and experiencing the great resignation, people are seeking three things: purpose, placement, and prosperity. They're seeking purpose in their lives. What am I called to do? What am I passionate about? They're also seeking placement in their lives. Where should I exercise that purpose? And then also, lastly, they're seeking prosperity. How do I live out my purpose while still making financial gains? People are seeking purpose, placement, and prosperity. Well, you are in for another surprise this week, as we will be talking again to the knowledgeable veteran. You asked for her and we brought her back, Miss Katrina Robinson, who is a loan partner at Summit Funding Incorporated. Katrina has been in and out of the industry for almost 22 years. I don't know about you, but last week I received so much information. We had part one, of which Katrina came and talked to us about all things credit, as well as the keys to real estate wealth building and investment. And then in part two, she continued her conversation. It was absolutely transformational. You all asked for her again, and now we're here at part three. Part three, Katrina Robinson is back with us to continue our conversation over wealth building, all things real estate. So let's welcome Katrina again. Katrina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Minister Dabney. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy that we were able to help some people last week and the week before that. And so I hope the rest of the month we're able to do the same.
Absolutely. One thing that I heard constantly was, where's part one? Where's part two? Where's part three? Where's part four? I mean, the people wanted you back. And typically in these series, we do try to diversify the speaker, right? To give everyone an opportunity on the platform. But you were just literally requested and demanded so greatly that I said, hey, let's just bring her back for the rest of the month. And that way you can just dive into key topics. For me, I was just so impressed by the wealth of knowledge you had around the industry. As I mentioned before last week, I know you as Trina affectionately, right? And I know Trina, we kick it, Trina, right?
Yes.
Professional button up, Trina. And I was just like, oh yeah, she bringing it, right? And so information that you brought to the table, I was just impressed. It actually helped me as well as others, like I said, that I'm connected to. And I know all of our listeners are so excited about the information that we're even going to dive into today. So let's kind of talk about some key topics here. There is a hot discussion in the market right now, this idea of renting versus buying. What's so interesting about this topic is I think people tend to understand that there's benefits on both ends, right? We're preached to and taught to purchase. As we talked about last week, that's the way to wealth building, that's the way to investments. But sometimes there is a reason and there is justification for renting, right? Ultimately,
Absolutely.
the end goal is to, I'm sure, buy. But I guess our first question here today is, how does one decide if renting or buying is best for them? It's kind of a two-part question. And then, particularly in the current economy, what would you recommend? So, first, dive into how do you decide if you should rent or buy? And then, considering what's going on in our current economy, where we're talking about rising costs, inflation is at an all-time high, right? We're also seeing possibly us moving into another recession. What would you recommend at this stage?
Sure, this is a great question. First of all, I would always say that anytime you have an opportunity to own something for yourself, it's the best option. However, that doesn't necessarily mean now is the time. It is really based on your savings, it is based on your personal goals, it is also based on your lifestyle. A lot of positions are remote these days. And so now it actually makes more sense for people to own because a lot of people are working from their homes. But then you also have a lot of occupations, especially as it relates to the pandemic and COVID, you have traveling nurses, you have traveling doctors, you have accountants that are traveling the world to go and help these big and these small businesses balance their books and things like that, where they're moving from city to city and sometimes country to country. Minister Dabney, I know you know about that for sure. So it would not necessarily make sense for you or anyone who travels for work or travels for pleasure on a consistent basis to own, because then you have a property that's kind of vacant, or you have to put a renter into your property. And then what happens when there's a problem? Now
Right.
you're out of the country and you're still responsible for this home that you've signed on the dotted line for. So in those particular instances, and as well as in some instances, it can be cheaper to rent, especially if you're looking to build your savings account, or you like to party, or you like to travel. Sometimes, depending on where it is that you choose to lease or rent from, it is actually less expensive and less of a headache than actually owning. So I would definitely say those would be the three things that would kind of determine. So it'd be your savings, your personal goals, and your lifestyle. That would determine on whether or not it's best for you to rent or to own. In today's economy, right now, as I stated before, it's a seller's market. And so the sellers kind of have an advantage on the buyers, because buyers are willing to pay an upcharge to actually own their homes. And so, as well as over the last few months, right after the war began, interest rates have increased as well. So, if you are going to buy, now is definitely the time to do so, because I do predict that interest rates are going to continue to go up, just as you stated, with gas prices and all of this. But then once we balance out, then the market is gonna kind of stabilize a little bit and or deteriorate. So now you're gonna get this opportunity to buy this home later on that may not be worth as much as you have to actually pay for it. And that's one of the issues that we have even now, is because these appraisals are coming in so much lower than what the buyers are asking to the buyers are asking to pay for it. But what happens then is now, in a couple of years, you have this $500,000 house that was only worth 350. You've paid 500,000 for it. And so now someone tries to come into your neighborhood and now they only pay 350 for their house. Now you have $150,000 worth of equity that you no longer have anymore, based on the market. So if you're going to do it now, but definitely analyze your lifestyle, your personal goals, and your savings before you make that decision.
You bring up such a few great points. Actually, I want to kind of touch on a few things. The one thing that you mentioned first that stood out to me was this idea of renting versus buying, and making sure that you understand the position that you're in and why you're doing it, right? So obviously you have to be in a financially stable position to purchase a home. We understand that. You did so eloquently last week, articulated how your credit score and making sure you have enough money, your money management, skills, and your money management habits, all of those things are critical
Sure.
to purchase. But also, one thing I've also kind of heard or gleaned from your conversation is this idea of renting being kind of that preparatory step before buying, right? In the sense of, I know for a fact that when you buy, a lot of people want to understand, hey, what is your rental history? They want to see those consistent payments as a part of the process, right? From issuing you a loan, do you pay your bills on time? Like, that kind of pays,
For sure.
goes along with the credit. But also, are you paying your rent on time? Are you paying other things on time? And so it's kind of that preparatory step. And so I would probably agree with you in that, if you're wanting to buy, first take the time to rent so that you understand what it means, especially if you've never rented before, right? Take the time to rent to understand what it means to pay a mortgage or a rent on a monthly basis, right? And then also understand what it means to manage bills before you take on a whole home with this huge debt, where you literally probably have never had to pay any type of monthly bill. So that's kind of like that gateway into buying. Another thing that you said that I thought was just really important was this idea of understanding how the interest rates fluctuate, because you can, in fact, go in and overpay for a home, which then you find yourself in a deficit after some time. So then you're almost upside down, right, in your equity, to your point. And that's something that I think is more relevant to today, because just in the market right now, people are just grossly overpricing homes.
They are.
Grossly overpricing homes, right?
They are.
The
Yes.
area that I live in, even, I know these homes are not worth nearly as much as I'm
No.
seeing them on Zillow, yet and still, because people at the time of the pandemic were so excited and so desiring a space to just live, people were able to just overly price and pay, or get rather, for their homes, just this insane amount of money over the asking. But what we're seeing now, to your point, later on down the line, when the market stabilizes, as you mentioned, you've now invested so much money in this home, but then you're almost upside down because you can't recover that amount that you've paid over that, original, I don't know if it's the market price for the home. And so that's something that's important. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people don't really realize is that the pandemic, all of the benefits that came from the federal government to help not only small business owners and individuals as well, but it helped homeowners extremely as well. And
Mhm.
that's because interest rates are backed by, well, they are controlled by the federal backed securities, right? And so when the pandemic actually happened, all of the money that the government was kind of giving out and pouring back to stimulate the economy, they also were stimulating the marketplace and reducing those interest rates. And so you could get, literally this time last year, you could get a conventional interest rate for 2.75 for 30 years, which is unheard of. It's the all-time low. Now those interest rates are back up to 4%, 4.25, 5. So what people need to understand is that you're in this long-term contract for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, sometimes even 40 years. And you have to think about how the market is going to fluctuate in those 40 or 30 years if you hold on to this mortgage. So that is also one of the reasons why there were benefits to it then, but now we're starting to pay for it because people are overpricing their homes and people are actually buying them because
Yes.
the interest rates are still pretty low. And so now that of course it stimulates the real estate market, but it's not going to last forever. That's for sure.
No, such a great point. And I'm happy you mentioned it. Like I said, I see that so much. And that's one of my major concerns, especially in talking to people that are buying, making sure they're understanding, as you said it's so great, right? Make a plan and understand not only what the home costs today and you're falling in love with it and it sounds great to purchase it, but think about the future investment, right? Are you
Absolutely.
going to get that equity back? A lot of times, what we've seen in the current market, especially over the last few years, is this huge evolution of technology. So there was a time, and still is a time, where real estate agents and you meeting a person in person and they having access to this MLS, this huge list of homes available, and then you go with them and you walk home to home and they take you to see many homes. That still happens, but now things have evolved significantly where you can go through an app such as Zillow or Redfin. And a lot of these homes have a key and security code that you punch in, right? A unique code. You go self tour the home, or they have these virtual tours, and you go see the home. And even with these apps, you can go in and apply for a home, right? You can get pre approved or apply
Mhm.
for the home or purchase it directly. So I have a question for you regarding that. Would you recommend using an online site such as Zillow or Redfin to purchase or rent? Or would you kind of steer towards the more traditional way? And kind of what are some benefits and challenges of both? Kind of that more, analog versus digital perspective of trying to buy a home and searching for a home.
Redfin and Zillow. So, because I am connected to a mortgage company, I'm unable to be transparent. But those Redfin, Zillow, those are owned actually by mortgage bankers and brokers.
Hmm.
So they have. So when you go in, and you're applying for a home, especially if it's a purchase, then you are automatically sending your information to the different lenders that actually own. So what they do is they buy the list basically. So whoever is interested in purchasing this home, they're getting all of your information up front, and then that's when they start calling you. And they're
Okay.
calling you because they're letting you know you're pre-qualified or you're pre-approved. And then if you don't get that particular, if you don't win that particular bid for the house, now they've got your information. So now it's their way, it's kind of their marketing strategy to get more leads and to get more people to use their mortgage bank. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you have to remember, especially with renting, is that most of the time when the homes are placed on Redfin or Zillow or any of the other search engines, a lot of times they're there for 1 or 2 days, and then it says contingent or it says under contract. A lot of times that's because there is a delay, there's a lag where it's actually posted, but it has to go through an approval process. While they're going through an approval process, they're either working with another agent, they're working with a rental agent or rental broker, and now these agents have actual pre-approved people that they're immediately showing the property to. So you have to be careful. You also have to be careful with the Zestimates that come on Zillow and Redfin, because a lot of times those are not necessarily true in fact to the number. It's just their Zestimate based on the market, and it's generally based on the neighborhood within 1 or 2 miles, but it is not necessarily the correct appraisal amount that is actually the value of the home. So I would definitely recommend getting a real estate agent for sure. Why? Because it's a personal connection, number one. Number two, you're able to explain to your agent exactly what it is you're looking for. I need 2 bedrooms. I need an extra office. I want 1.5 baths. I want it all on one floor. And they have more expertise. Not only do they have, to your point, access to those particular listings as well, but they have a larger database by the MLS. And a lot of some people don't necessarily use Redfin or Zillow to list their homes, but they use the MLS because they're working with a broker or an agent. And homeowners work with agents because it's kind of out of their hands. They don't have to really worry about, controlling or navigating the listing themselves. They speak to an agent who they trust, and they believe that not only their relationships with the clients that they have, but their relationships with other agents is going to bring them a qualified buyer. And so I would definitely recommend that you go with a seasoned professional real estate agent, either or, whether you are renting or buying, because real estate agents in today's market, they do have rentals as well. And I don't think a lot of people know that, but they do.
No, that's such a great point that you mentioned, about the capital gains. Thank you for correcting that, because I definitely was misinformed about that as well. So that's
Yeah.
really, really critical to know. But also, when you talk about these estimates, right? So that's something that I always tend to think like, oh, well, this kind of shows what it would be, or kind of how the home has appreciated over time, especially if you look at a home that, on Zillow says it's off market, and then it has its estimate of what it would go for today in the current market. But that's great that you trued that up, because that is a misnomer that a lot of people don't really understand. It may not necessarily hold a lot of weight versus a true and, in fact, actual appraisal. So I guess I want to understand a little bit more around that. Would you say that those estimates, if you could give it like a percentage, like what would you say is the percent accuracy of those estimates based on your understanding?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a good place to start. So I want to say 80 to 85% of those in the range are really accurate. It just really depends on who's listing it. Because once again, if I'm a seller and I am not seasoned in the real estate market, and just because I saw my neighbor's house sell for $500,000, that doesn't necessarily mean that we match in square footage, that we match in the cosmetics of the home, that we match in the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, what's considered a bedroom, especially if you're speaking about a bedroom or a space in the basement. And so I can't necessarily list my home for 500,000 just because my neighbor did. Real estate agents, of course, when they actually listed and they use those tools, those are a little bit more accurate because they have the sales history. They also have the comparables based on mileage, because you're only supposed to compare your home in value without crossing any major streets within 1 mile. And so that's how you kind of come up with the value of your home without having an actual appraisal done. So I would say 80 to 85%, sometimes even 90. It just depends who's listing it, and it also depends on the area, right?
And
Because
does it also,
my home in Harvey for 200,000 is not going to be the same in, Tinley Park for 200,000.
absolutely, to your point, cosmetically, spacing, square
Square
footage.
footage, for sure.
One thing that I also wanted to maybe ask about, and as I
And
mentioned,
the neighborhood.
in the neighborhood,
Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, square footage, neighborhood, cosmetic details. Another thing I wanted to ask about is this idea of inspection too, because to your point, a home may from the outset appear to be pristine and there's no issues with the home. And so the Zestimate could say based on those three factors, neighborhood, cosmetic, as well as square footage, that it's this amount. But once you start digging into that home and get a professional inspection, maybe there's leakage or maybe there's other issues within the home that can also impact that estimate. So I think that's such a great point that you made, just around ensuring that you don't lean so much on those estimates, but you kind of go the appropriate route to make sure that you're getting it properly appraised. So we talked about renting and buying. We've also talked about obviously a number of things that we need to look into when we're making these decisions over the last three parts here. When we talk about though this idea of real estate, I think a lot of people tend to feel a little bit overwhelmed or intimidated because the terminology can be overwhelming. I have to say, even for myself, sometimes I find myself fishing for words to really explain what I'm trying to say, because the terminology is very specific, it's very niche to the market, right? And so, you being the resident expert for the month, what we wanted to do today is really take some time and kind of dive into the terminology to help the listeners to understand what are some of those key terminologies that we should definitely be looking for. So, I guess my last question as we wrap up this third part of our review is, what key real estate terminology should we be aware of, and how does knowledge of these terms impact the buying experience? And before we dive into your response, I just want to kind of give a preface to the listeners to say, hey, get out some paper and pen because Miss Katrina is about to take us to class. Okay. So you want to write down everything she tells you and really study what it is that she's telling you, so that as you are going out to buy a home, you're educated and you're well versed with the terminology and with the knowledge of knowing what it is that they're saying, so that things aren't going over your head, and you're not feeling overwhelmed. So let us know, what is some of that key terminology? What does it mean, right? What are the definitions, and what should we be looking for and asking for, and how can they impact our experience in buying?
For sure. So I'm going to actually start with your last comment as it relates to inspections versus appraisals. Inspections are generally, maybe about 98% of the time, they are not required unless you have a village, unless you're moving into a village who requires them in order to get transfer stamps, and I will explain that to you. But otherwise, they're not required. I highly suggest you get one. Why? Because the inspection lets you know what's wrong with the property. An appraisal lets you know how much the property is worth. It is two totally different things, because the inspection, they will go, into the intricacies of your chimney and your roof, and your piping behind the walls and your electricity. It'll let you know if there's any major repairs that are going to be needed with your water heater or your furnace. And those could be large expenses that you incur the day you close and you move in and you turn on the water and the pipe bust. But because you didn't get an inspection, it's your cost now. So
So
the difference.
I want to pause here, Trina, because
Yes,
you just blew my mind. Okay.
yes.
What I did not know was that it wasn't required. I
No,
just
only appraisals are required.
So inspections are not required when purchasing a home. People, listen to this out. This is critical, because you could be walking into a whole mess of a home and you don't even know, right?
No, no. So the mortgage company is basically relying on the appraisal to say this house is worth 500,000, so you can lend 500,000 on this house, and you should get your money back, right?
But the state of the home doesn't feed into that. That's
It
interesting.
does not.
That's
It
very,
does
to me,
not.
they kind of go hand in hand, right? Totally get the financial backing. Okay, if
Yes,
the house costs this much, fine. But I would kind of want to solidify my investment to make sure that it's not a lemon, right?
absolutely.
So that's
Absolutely. And that's why I tell
required.
every single one of my buyers, please get an inspection. It runs anywhere between $300 and $500. But unless it is a VA loan, now with VA loans, only a pest and termite inspection is required.
And we
But
talk
there is
about VA
still.
loans, we're talking about loans for veterans,
That's
correct?
correct.
Okay.
That's correct. So when we get into our next segment, we get into programs, I will begin to kind of give you some differences in that as well. But that is the actual only program that requires, from a mortgage perspective, any type of inspection. Now, again, depending on the village of where you live, sometimes they require an inspection. But that's up to the seller's attorney to find out, because that's a seller's issue. But from a mortgage perspective, inspections are not required.
Wow.
Only appraisals. Only appraisals. So that is the difference
That's
between.
scary. If
It
I'm
is.
honest with you, I'm just sitting here like, oh my goodness,
It
right?
is. It
It's
is.
scary to think of. You're investing in some cases $500,000, three to 5 million, or even if it is 100, that's still a lot of money, right? $50,000 is a lot of money. You are investing anything into something and saying, I'm going to take out this loan, pay on this, and it's not even required to assess the state and the condition of the home. And when you think about things such as like uh, some of the more critical issues, like I said, leaking, as well
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
termites, or even pest control is a whole
Mm-hmm.
other thing in
Mm-hmm.
itself. Or
Yes.
just thinking about some of molding issues or things that can sincerely and seriously affect your health. You just would assume that that would be a requirement, right?
And
But I don't know. It's just
unfortunately,
mind blowing to me.
yeah, no, no. And unfortunately, probably 98% of buyers do not get an inspection if it is not
Wow,
required. No, they don't.
98%.
Yes.
Okay, you all out there that are listening and looking to buy a home, please set aside. Miss Katrina said only about $500, give or take. I would strongly recommend. I'm not the resident expert, but she is also pushing the narrative.
I
Please
am.
go and get an inspection, because this
Absolutely.
is the determination of you investing almost $20,000 to $30,000 in damages potentially if you really don't know what's going on with the home.
That is correct. Especially if
Wow.
it is not custom built, or it's not a gut rehab or anything like that. If you are just
Mm.
purchasing from a owner, a regular, just an owner, I highly suggest that you get an inspection. But most people don't,
Okay,
unfortunately.
sorry, I had to park there because I just couldn't believe it. I'll let you continue on with class. So we talked about inspection, right? That's
Inspection versus appraisal. Yes.
appraisal. Okay.
So now we're going to go get into the actual mortgage process. So there's a difference between pre-qualification, pre-approval, and approval. Okay. So pre-qualification is basically when a cold caller or a loan officer you're introduced from a realtor to the client. and you're basically having a conversation and you're gathering information based on only specifically what the client is telling you. Okay. So I'm telling you, I've been in my home, I've been renting for 2 years. I have a 700 credit score. I've been on my job 20 years and I make $100,000. Based on that, they will offer you a pre-qualification letter that basically says, if all of this stuff is true, you qualify for this.
Mm,
Okay. That's just based on a conversation. The pre approval is actually when you send in your information, a full application is taken on you, and your credit is pulled. Once your credit is pulled and we see 500, yeah, no, then you no longer, you're not even pre-approved anymore. You're not even pre-qualified. But after we actually take the loan application from you, you sign all of the loan disclosures and we pull your credit. You send in your bank statements, you send in your W-2s or your tax returns, and you send in your check stubs. Then we issue you a pre-approval letter because now we see what's in front of us. We can prove that you are actually doing and what you say you're doing in your pre-qualification conversation. And then we offer you a letter that says you qualify to purchase up to 500,000. You use that letter, you take that letter to your realtor, and then you go and you shop for your home. I highly suggest you get pre-approved before you go and look for homes. Please, 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 because what happens is people end up getting discouraged because they go out, they find this beautiful home based on a pre-qualification
mm,
conversation, and they find this $500,000 home. But then after we get all of the information and we actually calculate your income, we actually look at your credit, look at your debt to income ratio, which I will get into. Now you only qualify for 300,000. So now you went out and you found this beautiful home that you've fallen in love with, and you don't qualify for it anymore. And so now your expectation is to find this beautiful home like this 500,000 for 300, and you're not gonna do it. So please, please, please get pre-approved before you even contact a realtor. Or if you have a realtor, you get a recommendation from that realtor, speak to a loan officer before you do anything. Okay. So
that's
that's
a really good point, right?
yeah,
That you made. I want to just quickly comment on that. So you talked about pre-qualification versus pre-approval.
yes,
Pre-qualification is I'm just ad hocly entering information based on what I know of myself. Whereas the pre approval process is where your actual credit is then pulled and then they're digging deeper into the information that, in fact, you provided to verify that it's true.
that is correct.
And with the pre approval, only then will you be able to then get an understanding of how much you'll be able or how much house you can afford, in
That is
essence.
correct. That is correct.
Okay,
That is correct.
excellent. And one
Um,
thing I wanted to add about or ask about that, or add to your comment, is you made a comment around the fact that you give that pre-approval letter then to your real estate agent. I wanted to just ask a question for clarification because I know sometimes people tend to assume that the real estate agent can actually see your inner financial workings. But in fact, no, they only see, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is they only see the amount you're approved for, but they don't get the opportunity to see what the loan officer sees, which is, your debt to equity ratio, which you'll speak to, or your income and so on and so forth. They just see, hey, you're approved for this amount, done. Is that
that
is
that
correct?
is absolutely 100% correct. Your real estate agents, your attorneys, nobody outside of your mortgage lender gets into your personal finances and or your credit. Nobody except for your mortgage lender. The pre-approval letter generally states your name, your address, and it says congratulations, you are pre-approved to purchase a up to a 4 unit for $350,000. Your estimated interest rate is 4.25%. A lot of times your pre-approval letter does not even have your estimated payment, because it depends on the area that you're in as it relates to calculating your payment for what your taxes and insurance are going to be. So a lot of times we don't even know what that payment is going to look like until you actually enter into a contract on our home. So no, your real estate agents and your attorneys, they do not have access unless you provide it. They do not have access to your finances and credit. No, not at all.
That's good to know, because I know some people that have actually steered away from using certain real estate agents, maybe that are, more common or more familiar, because they're afraid, oh my goodness, this person can see my personal finances. But my understanding was the same. So thank you for clarifying that. So you
Now
talked.
they can see it if you're renting, because a lot of times they have to take the application on you. And so
Makes sense.
the real estate, the realtors will pull your credit, and they will analyze your income if they're looking for a place for you to rent, because there's certain parameters that they have to make sure that you qualify for the lease unit. But for buying, no, they don't have that information.
No, that's definitely helpful. So we talked about so far pre-qualification, pre-approval. We talked about also appraisal versus inspection.
Yes.
What else do we then have on the table as well here?
Yeah, so I also wanted to talk about the actual approval status, because a lot of people think because you're pre-approved, you're actually, that's it, I got my loan, and that's not it. So then what happens is after you contract on a home, then we send all of your information. So we send the sales contract for the purchase of the home, all of your information, including your credit report, your income, your assets, all of that information into what's called underwriting. And underwriting is the actual individual or the department that looks at all of the program regulations and rules and say, yes, you qualify based on what the guidelines are for this particular program. Once that is done, then your actual approval is sent out to your processor. And a lot of people, they get a little frustrated because up front at the pre-approval status, you might have to send in, two check stubs. Let's just say your last two check stubs in the last 30 days and your last two bank statements. By the time it gets to underwriting and it comes out of underwriting, then underwriting can say, yes, you're approved, but I need an updated check stub or an updated bank statement. So a lot of clients, they get a little frustrated because they're like, I sent this in already. You have to understand that we're on real time. And most of the time, those documents are only valid for 30 days. Well, a lot of times when you're sending in your pre-approval stuff, it takes you a while to find a house. So I can send in my pre-approval stuff in January, but I'm not able to secure an actual home to buy in a contract until March. Now all of that stuff that I sent in is no longer valid. So now I have to resend it again. So just understand it's 3 steps: pre-qualification, pre-approval, and then your actual approval. And then please understand that most of the time you will have to send in updated documents of documents you've already sent.
I wanted to, that's a great point. I'm happy you definitely explain that, because I've heard people in the process say, oh my gosh, they're asking for the same information. And to your point, they get a little agitated, but it makes sense. It's timing, right? And they still have to make sure that you're in the same position you were when you started out on the journey. So that makes complete sense. One
Yes.
thing I would ask as well is clarification around something very, what may seem basic, but we're kind of speaking to it a little bit, this idea of a loan officer versus a real estate agent, because I think that's kind of the break where people think that real estate agents do what loan officers do, but it sounds like there's a distinction between the two.
It
So
is.
just briefly touch on that, and then we can get back to the other terminology, but I think that's a critical distinction as well.
Yeah, it's real simple. So the real estate agent is the individual who will find the home for you. The loan officer is the individual who will qualify you for the loan to purchase the home. So those are the differences between the two. It's really cookie cutter, it's really black and white. Now when you get into the actual mortgage process, there are generally 4 to 5 individuals that are involved in the loan process. With the real estate agent, it's generally just one person, and that's your agent. They go, they find the house for you, you sign the contract, you send it over to us, and now you have kind of a team of people that are working in the backgrounds on the mortgage side of it, which generally would be your loan officer, your loan processor, your underwriter, and your closer. So four people essentially. Those are the four people kind of that make up the mortgage team, when we're doing any type of financing. So that would be the difference between the two of those.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So we've now talked about pre-approval. We've talked about pre-qualification, appraisal versus inspection, real estate agent versus loan officer. What are some other key terminologies that we need to break down? You also talked about the approval process.
Yeah.
What should we, be aware of that could possibly impact our experience?
For sure. So there are three more points that I kind of want to touch on that are really kind of important, and a lot of people don't understand exactly what that means. So DTI, which is debt to income ratio, and basically what that means is how much debt that you have versus how much income that you're bringing in. Now, one of the tragedies from the 2008, 2009, 2010 real estate market collapse was there was a lot of subprime lending at that time. And what that basically means is loan officers were qualifying borrowers for more of a home than they could actually afford. And they were putting them in these, adjustable rate mortgages. And again, that is so much terminology. Like we would probably have to do like a 5-part to that. But anyway, debt to income ratio. So the one thing that I want people to understand is you have two ratios that you look at when you are actually buying. So you have your front end ratio, which is all of your debt to your income without your mortgage payment. Your back end ratio is all of your debt to your income with your mortgage payment. And with your mortgage payment also includes your insurance, and it also includes your taxes, as well as if you have HOA, which is homeowners association dues if you're purchasing a condo or a townhome. What is so important is that the trust in your loan officer is number one, because your income is based off of gross, not net. And so if your loan officer is pushing you to that 50%, which is the max back end debt ratio, which includes your mortgage, but they're not taking into consideration that you have taxes that you have to pay, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. So definitely try to keep your debt to income ratio at 40%. That's what I say. Programs go up to 50. Loans that are specific to veterans have no back end. VAs can go to 100% debt ratio. That is a perk that they actually have, that the veterans actually have. So that is super important that you make sure that you're asking your loan officer, well, what is my debt ratio? Because I still have to think about taxes. I have to think about savings. I have to think about traveling, expenses. I don't want to push myself based on my gross versus what my net actually is, because you could be in a totally different tax bracket after they take out taxes. You can make 6 figures, but then when they tax you at 33%, now you all the way down somewhere else. So just make sure that you're looking at your debt to income ratio. The other part is what's called CTC. So debt to income ratio is DTI. CTC is clear to close. And so whenever you actually have your loan processor or your loan officer or your realtor calling you and say, you're clear to close, that means you're done. All you have to do is show up. If you have to bring any money to closing, you bring your ID and your money to closing, you're done. Until you hear CTC or clear to close, they're still working in the background. So with that being said, your contract might have you closing on May the 31st. If you're not CTC by May the 31st, Your closing gets pushed back. And a lot of people, well, why did my closing get pushed back? Because you were not CTC, you were not clear to close. So that's definitely a term that a lot of people say, well, what is CTC? I don't even know what that means. That's exactly what that means. Um, and then the other part is that you have to realize, depending on what state you're listening from, every state is not an attorney state. Illinois happens to be an attorney state. And so if you are not in a state, Georgia, it's a few other ones, Texas, um, you don't have an attorney to look over your contract. I highly suggest that you get one. If it's just for consultation, have them to look over your contract, have them to look over your mortgage documents, because it is important that you actually understand the language in those real estate contracts. And a lot of those contracts are 6 pages long. And so it talks about taxes, it talks about escrow, it talks about your earnest money and how you can lose your earnest money, because you can lose your earnest money, which is essentially a down payment, if you don't close on time, because the sellers, they have to stay in that home and maybe actually pay another mortgage because you're not ready. So you have to look at all of those things. So I highly suggest that you get an attorney, even if you are not in an attorney state. And then you can always, email me or call me, but there's so much more that goes into different terminologies.
I was just sitting here thinking as you were talking. I mean, this is a topic we could probably do a whole 6 month series on real estate
For
transparently,
real.
because there's so much information. Because
Yes.
even if you were speaking, my mind was saying, well, what does that mean? Or, oh, I should ask this question here. But I'm like, okay, let's stay on topic, because there's so much to talk about. So you talked
Yeah.
about DTI, so debt to income ratio. That's a key ratio, as you mentioned, when we're talking about how much debt do you have to your income. And your key point was to stay under 40%. Now, is that kind of an industry standard, or is that more of a best practice?
No, that's just kind of a best practice. A lot of loan officers, probably 90% of loan officers, will push you to the max.
To the
Because,
50.
and why are they pushing you to the max? Because they get paid off of the loan amount. And so the higher the loan amount, of course, the more income that they receive. And that's
They
just
get a
that's just the
commission
truth
off
of it
of
all.
transactions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's just the
So
truth
that's
of
the
it
best
all.
practice for our listeners, to make sure that you're staying at that max 40% DTI.
I would definitely say max, for sure, 45, for sure, not a penny over 45, because a lot of times, based on where you live, your taxes are going to drive a lot of your mortgage payment. We have some homes here in the state of Illinois, in Tinley Park, even in some of your more challenged areas. In Harvey, we just closed on a house and the taxes are $7,000 a year. So that's an extra, $600 a month just in taxes. And then because of the area, the insurance was an extra, like 150. So before they even tap into their actual mortgage payment, they're already out $750.
Wow.
So your taxes definitely can drive up your debt ratio, because it has nothing to do with the actual loan itself. So definitely 45. If you're pushed to 50, just understand you know what you're getting yourself into after you're taxed. Because I've seen so many times where a lot of people have to reduce their 401k contributions because they have this mortgage payment to make now, and it was based off of their gross, but now they're being taxed and now they're struggling. So now they're reducing their 401k contributions, their saving contributions, their owe taxes at the end of the year, because they have to increase their deductions during the year so that they can make sure they have enough money to pay their mortgage. So please, 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 just be, very conscious of that when you're making those type of decisions.
No,
Live
that's
under your means. That's what I had to learn. Live under your means in order to prosper, in order to be financially successful.
No, I appreciate that. And I think it's so important that you call that out, because, again, some people just don't understand. And it could be, like you said, that loan officer is pushing to that 50% without people knowing, hey, on the back end, they get commission off of this. So the idea is to push you to the max, but it's not the best financially financial decision for you to be pushed to that max. So 45 being the absolute max for your DTI. Then you talked about CTC, clear to close. Definitely, it sounds like to me that's the place where you start to celebrate. If you are a
Yes.
champagne drinker, you pop your champagne, pop your
Yes.
bottle, right? And you
Yes.
go celebrate because now you've kind of reached that end stage, right?
Yes.
And so it seems to me that the process in itself is very complex, but with you breaking down some of this terminology, I think you've helped us to understand those terms a bit better so that we really understand what we should be looking for in the buying process. Again, the pre-approval versus the pre-qualification, very very important distinction. Then we're looking at inspection versus appraisal, right? Understanding what that final approval process looks like, and then also understanding that the real estate agent is not necessarily the loan officer. They do have distinguished roles that fit their purpose from a buying perspective. And then here we're talking about DTI versus CTC. You also mentioned as well having your documentation ready. I think that's a really really key best practice, because as you said, if you're not ready and the buyer is ready to go, or the seller is ready to go, you could lose your earnest money, you could lose your down payment because you're
Absolutely.
taking too long and you're not organized. So I think coming to the table, what I'm hearing is you need to already be prepared. So working with someone, whether it's your real estate agent or the loan officer, and making sure that all your documentation is in place and readily available so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're already losing before you even close on the home.
Absolutely.
So that's a really, really great point. Katrina, it has been amazing. I truly am just literally smiling because every time we meet, we're just going for the full hour. So we'll be definitely showing this as a full hour, because next week we will be diving into a new topic. We're
Yes.
super excited. So thank you again for coming. And next week, I ask all our listeners to come back, because Katrina will be giving us information on all things real estate, particularly within the area of housing programs. This I am excited about. Let me
Yes.
tell you a quick testimony why I'm excited about this.
Okay.
Because I had no idea that they existed, right? I was someone that just assumed you had to go through the very conventional, traditional way of buying a home. And then I started hearing programs such as like NACA and all these other
Yes.
programs that are so beneficial to people that look like us, right?
Yes.
Black and
Yes.
brown people's minorities, because there is such a thing as, if, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it redlining? It's
Yes.
the
Yes.
terminology. Okay, I'll
Yes.
give it a plus, right?
Yes. Yes.
Redlining,
Now,
right?
do you know what redlining is?
I'm gonna guess, and then obviously I need the resident expert
Okay.
to back
Okay.
me, okay?
Okay.
So what I understood redlining to be is where we have individuals or the mortgage companies are hiking up interest rates for minorities, or even kind of boxing them out so that they can't get approved for a home. Am I
Or declining a loan.
declining a loan?
Even with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, they still have redlining in place on the back end. So you were absolutely 100% correct.
Yay,
Yes.
me. Okay. Okay, I'm learning, right? But
Yes.
that's something that we'll talk about next week. It's so important, right? And so we'll leave with that conversation. Katrina
Okay.
will give us a little bit more context around redlining and why these housing programs even came about, why they're so important to our Black and Brown communities, and the benefits. There are so many benefits when it comes to it, especially if we have people or listeners that are challenged in credit, right? There's programs that don't even tap into your credit score. You just have to prove out history payments as well as income and so on and so forth, savings. There's just so much opportunity. So
Yes.
please come back for next week. You definitely do not want to miss out, especially if you are someone that maybe have had problems trying to buy the more traditional way. This will be the session for you. So thank you so much, Katrina. This week has been phenomenal. We touched on the rent versus buy, as well as key terminology. I am always learning, and I'm just a learning head. I'm just like a little bit nerded out in that way. I love to learn new information. And so real estate is something that I'm kind of starting to tap in just as of recent. And so just even being here with you, sitting down and talking to you about these terminologies, as well as understanding the significance of it, has just been even beneficial to me. And I know for sure it has been beneficial to our listeners because they're giving us the feedback. So on next week, we ask that you come back with our resident expert in real estate, Katrina, and we'll talk about again the housing programs, and we'll also collect some of your questions So at the end of next week, seeing that it will be our final week, unfortunately, we'll make sure that she can answer some of those questions as well. So thank you so much for your time. Katrina, before we leave, if you want to just plug again your social media handles so that those that are maybe concerned with more questions or have more questions around the topic, they can reach out to you.
Absolutely. So I am Trina Robinson on Facebook. You can also contact me via email at katrinamrobinson@yahoo.com. You can also give me a call at 708-275-2661. And I'd love to hear from you. There's no fee. I don't charge a fee or anything like that to consult with anyone. Just let me know where you're from so I can give a shout out to South Suburban, my home church, my love. But we're definitely here to help for sure.
Yes. And I also just want to add to that. Please understand you will be talking to Katrina, the professional. So conversations with her at this stage is confidential. Obviously, this is what she does for a living. And so if you need the help, if you're curious, don't be shy to reach out because of the commonality and the familiarity. She is professional. Again, those conversations are confidential. So I highly encourage you to reach out because as you can see, this girl knows what she's talking about. So with that, thank you so much again, Katrina, for joining us this week, and come back again next week for you all watching. We will have her again letting us know about the housing programs as we wrap up our fourth week to this midweek moment, all things real estate, wealth building. Thank you all so much. See you until next week. Take care.